Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being on. I'm Assembly Minority Leader Will Barkley, and we're here today to talk about the eviction moratorium bill that's about to be extended. Obviously, this pandemic has had serious financial impacts, and I think we in Albany need to recognize that these impacts have been felt on both sides of the housing sector. Unfortunately, this eviction moratorium fails to do that. I'm happy to be joined by some special guests who have taken time out of their schedule. And they've taken time out of their schedule because they know this issue is so important, because they're so passionate about this issue, and because their stories need to be heard. So with us today, we're joined by Jamie Keene, who's the Legislative Director for the New York Capital Region Apartment Association and Coalition Leader for Under One Roof. We also have Deb Hall, who's with the Finger Lakes Landlord Association. And we're also joined by some individuals who know better than anyone. They know better than anyone the unintended consequences and harsh realities caused by Albany's overreach into the pockets of property owners. We have Elise Zaccaro from New York City. We have Ime Smith from Albany. Ime, I hope I pronounced your name right. And we have Rich Tyson, who's from the city of Rochester. So as I've said, the pandemic's created financial issues for both tenants and property owners. However, unfortunately, we've crossed the line from protecting tenants facing difficulties to providing near immunity from paying rent. Extending the eviction moratorium for 4 more months doubles down on tenants' interests, but does nothing. It does nothing to solve the issues facing landlords as their expenses pile up. Unfortunately, Democrats in Albany are too comfortable allowing the cancel rent movement to drive policy decisions that are going to have devastating effects across the state. The only individuals being asked to shoulder any burden and responsibility are the state's landlords. Without protection and remedies for landlords, the state is facing a looming housing disaster. So as you're going to hear today, many landlords have reached a breaking point. The reality is truly dire. So with that, I want to introduce our ranker on the Housing Committee, Assemblyman Mike Fitzpatrick from Long Island. Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you, Will, and thank you to the members of the press for being here and all of our guests who have some very important things to say. Will, just to piggyback on your opening remarks, I once saw a program where a cagey old Southern Democrat had a very clever line. He said, in politics, he said, let my opponents have all the issues, just give me a villain. And the Assembly Democrats love to portray our property owners, people who provide safe, affordable housing, as the villain, better known as landlords. Landlords and property owners are not villains. They are small business people who provide a quality product, a safe, affordable home to people who need it. And while the progressive socialist wing of the Democratic Party, which seems to dominate Albany policymaking in this session, and those who were not this way are leaning in that direction as well, we are putting the needs, we certainly care for the needs of tenants, and they have been more than accommodated. But now we've reached a point of a breaking point where our property owners and landlords cannot operate without revenue. And this needs to change, and we are going to debate a bill this afternoon and try to convince our colleagues not to extend this, to at least follow CDC guidelines and extend it maybe 1 month, but not until August 1st. So I want to thank everyone for coming and turn it over to you, Will, to introduce our guests who have very interesting stories to tell. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mike. Your words are well taken, well said. First, as I said, we have Jamie Keene, who's the Legislative Director for the New York Capital Region Apartment Association. Jamie, would you be willing to say some words?
Sure. Thank you for having me. As you noted, I am the coalition leader of Under One Roof. We represent a group of small business landlords across the state of New York, mainly in the upstate area, who are not corporate conglomerate landlords. They are not hedge fund owners. These are homegrown landlords who have lived in these cities since the time they've grown up mostly and have prospered and purchased properties so that they could provide safe and reliable housing and be present in the cities that they own properties in. What has happened during this pandemic is that they are at jeopardy of losing their properties because they can't sustain the continuity of operations. During the pandemic, for over a year, these owners, as you will hear, they have maintained their duties as owners. They have paid their taxes, their water and their sewer bills. They have maintained their employees and their contractors to make sure tenants in the housing are taken care of. But these laws have gone too far. The current laws that are on the books in the state of New York, namely the Safe Harbor Act, which protects tenants with COVID-related hardship through a date yet to be determined in the future when all restrictions on non-essential gatherings and business operations are lifted, and the new Rent Relief Act, which has a built-in moratorium extension while the tenant is in the process of applying for aid, both will protect tenants that are absolutely in need. And that is the goal, to single out those that are in need from those who are abusing the system. Our landlords need to be protected as well. They are the only industry that has received no financial aid throughout the duration of this pandemic. And our fear is that what you will see and what has started to happen, and as a practitioner, it's coming across my desk daily, are contracts for sale, contracts for the state of California, for doctors, for people out of the country who are looking to buy properties in our cities. And we need to preserve these small business owners and their rights as property owners to make a living, as well as to provide the safe housing that our tenants are accustomed to up here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Good words, and appreciate your participation today. Next, we have Ime Smith, who is from the city of Albany and a property owner, I believe. Ime, would you be willing to say some words?
Yes, thank you. I live in the property that I rent. I have like a 4-unit with a garage. And like Jamie said, first off, the amusement parks are open, the malls are open, everything else is open. So I'm not exactly sure how the COVID is, people who live in houses are not allowed to go out when you could go out and do everything else. And this law, the no bail law, along with this, is a lose-lose situation for decent tenants, homeowners, and property owners. Because I have a case in point of a tenant who's never owned a property, a friend of mine, and she lived in a place and her neighbor was unmedicated. One minute he was nice, but then when he wasn't medicated, he would like break into cars, break windows, get in fights. He threw furniture from the balcony and actually broke her balcony window. And I guess obviously the landlord was not able to evict him. And my friend literally had to relocate and move to another building, a whole another property, and actually another city, just to get away from the chaos. And, so that's not helping tenants per se. And it's definitely not helping landlords. I know this past year and a half, I've lost almost a year of rent because of people not paying. And the people weren't, one guy, he's able to, party and do everything else, but he's not paying his rent. And the group of people, some squatters basically, with a big dog in my apartment above me, when they finally had to get out, unfortunately, because of code violation, when they finally left, they trashed my apartment. They took the trash and just poured it all over the apartment. They left maggots inside my freezer. They broke a window. And the only recourse I have is to take them to small claims where they're broke. And I don't even know where they are, because they ended up being squatters when their mom passed away. The guy brought in his girlfriend and his cousin, and they started partying, and I couldn't evict them. And I don't even know where they are. So, I had over $1,000 worth of damage, broken windows, maggots in my refrigerator and freezer, trash everywhere, dog pee all over the carpet. It was crazy. And I actually had a tenant this past January get the property get raided. The cops literally raided my apartment for drugs, and they had found drugs and a gun. And they raided a few other properties in Cohoes. And I was literally in the process of moving his stuff out and trying to get a new tenant. And he picked the lock, broke back in, started partying, and I'm trying to get someone to evict him now, because they're like, oh yeah, even though he was in jail and it was raided, you have to evict him. It's ridiculous. And how is it helping us? In fact, I've known a lot of landlords and homeowners literally get properties, trying to sell their property. And then you can have more abandoned. I called somewhere, I think last Monday, where they was talking about the something, what was it? Basically some type of rent stabilization for the city of Albany. And I said, how is that gonna help anyone? It's gonna be a lose-lose situation. Tenants, nobody wants neighbors from hell. And if you can't keep them in jail and you can't evict them, decent neighbors with families gonna try to move and relocate. And the landlords are basically stuck with like the tenants who are like turning the place into a hellhole, where any neighbor that can afford to leave will leave. And any property owner that can afford to sell or will just walk away, they'll end up walking away from properties. You have more abandoned properties. And I don't know how that's going to help anyone. Abandoned properties only attract rodents and raccoons and like fire hazard from homeless people or something. So I don't see how that helps anyone, having more abandoned properties. And I'm not getting a tax break on my escrow. My escrow has been raising. It's not the mortgage, but it's an escrow. And I mean, I can't get any help from that. And the city of Cohoes is not responsible for making these laws. But I mean, in fact, they think the laws are quite unfair and ridiculous as well. But, you know, I don't know. You're not getting any tax escrow from people who walk away from property no more than if you get tax escrow from an abandoned property. So I don't see the win-win situation. All I see is the properties owned and operated by drug dealers and people that are against the law. And to be honest, you could say it's kind of human nature. If you go somewhere and they're like, well, pay if you can or make a donation, like the New York State Museum, for example, or even the Smithsonian, I mean, it's free. So nobody thinks to pay if you don't have to. It's a great, like, thank you so much. It's a great museum. Oh, here's a donation if I can. And you don't even, it's like out of sight, out of mind. It's human nature. They're not going to pay if they don't have to. They're grateful for the opportunity. But I mean, it's not like they're purposely not paying. It's like, well, if I don't have to, I can save my money and use it for something else. So, I mean, you can't even really say it's their fault. They're just happy for the opportunity. We're the ones that's getting screwed.
Excellent words. Thank you, Ime. And unfortunately, your stories gotten all too common throughout New York State, but we appreciate you sharing those words with us. Next, we'd like to hear from another property owner. We have Rick Tyson, who's from the city of Rochester. Rich, are you still on?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Would you mind sharing your story with us?
No, and I appreciate the time. And Ime, good to see you again. It's been a while since I've seen you on a conference call.
Oh, thank you.
I'm a second generation real estate broker in Monroe County, Rochester, New York. I've been selling real estate for about 9 years, and I was passionate about connecting people with home, right? That whole idea of helping someone find a place to call home. So about 5 years ago, a good friend of mine from middle school, he and I kicked around the idea of starting to invest into rental property. And we were both called to the idea of creating the most affordable housing that folks can find. So we started our investing with basically buying rooming houses in the city of Rochester, really catering to the folks that can least afford housing, creating that most affordable opportunity, that I would say the first rung of the ladder of a housing opportunity. And that was going well for a while. The Tenant Protection Act then came into effect in 2019. And that unfortunately really started to change the dynamics between housing providers and tenants, and not necessarily for the better. What we saw was that housing providers we were stripped of most meaningful vetting processes that we had in trying to qualify a new tenant. And on the back end, we were basically any meaningful recourse was taken away from us in terms of follow-up if someone decided to, turn south, right? If somebody stopped paying rent, the best we could hope for was a judgment. It also extended the several week period for an eviction, and it pushed it out to a few months. And that started to raise concerns for me. And I started kind of barking up the tree of my local legislators, both the Monroe County, the city, and some of the state folks here local to Rochester. It didn't really get anywhere, unfortunately. And then, fast forward a few months and this moratorium kicks in. And what it did is it took folks that were already kind of changing how they were going about paying rent or lack thereof, and it just exacerbated the problem. And it made it to where a lot of folks were not paying rent. And it effectively functions like an enormous vacancy. But the difference is I can't refill the vacancy because there's still somebody in that unit. So, we got to a point at the end of last year where, I was keeping tabulations as to the rents that were supposed to have come in that had not. And we reached a point where we had lost more than our entire property tax liability to both the city of Rochester and Monroe County, which at the time was $87,000. For some parts of the state, that's probably a small number, but that was on 37 properties in the city of Rochester that we own. So I looked at my business partner and said, we're not independently wealthy guys, unfortunately. We're going to have to do something a little different here. And we started to sell properties. And I think Jamie touched on it. A lot of the property owners here in Rochester are not huge equity ownership type, things. We've got a couple big housing providers, but they're, relatively few. A majority of the folks that are providing housing, especially in the concentration of poverty, are the small landlords, the people that own several units. And even at 37 97 properties, that's still a relatively small portfolio compared to what, some portfolios look like out there. So we began to sell off a lot of these properties, and they are not going to local investors, which is of concern to me. Having grown up in this area and knowing kind of what has happened to the inner city for the last number of decades, we've got, to Ime's point, we've got, vacant properties or dilapidated properties. They tear them down and they put the 6x6 wooden post across the front yard so that nobody could drive a car on it. And it's blight on the community, and we don't see new investment coming back in. So it was disheartening to me to see that we were taking out of our concentration of poverty. Not only is there not enough wealth creation taking place there to begin with, but now we're exporting that wealth not only outside the region, but sometimes out of the state. And the chances of it coming back are slim. So that's of immense concern to me as a resident here, a resident of Monroe County, and living in a county that does have a concentration of poverty within it. So the other concern that I have about this rent moratorium is, I feel like it's goofy to say it, but it's something that needs to be said. As a housing provider, I actually don't want to evict people. Like literally the last thing I want to do, and most of us want to do, is evict people. I'm thrilled, and I pride myself on owning properties, and I acquired it, and there was a tenant who maybe had lived there through 2 or 3 different previous owners, and I can keep them in that unit. And oftentimes, if I can, I try to keep them at the existing rent, even if it's below market, in order to keep that person in that housing unit. But this moratorium, what it's doing is it's just kind of, it's crushing us at this point, to be honest. The reality is if somebody has in fact experienced the hardship, and I know there are folks who have, I have tenants that have, and I haven't even mentioned an eviction process. They're coming to me when they can, and they're giving me what they can. And there's a chance that I'll relieve a lot of that rent myself at some point. The folks that can't afford it, the people that are on SSI, disability, other fixed incomes that are not garnishable, haven't experienced that hardship. And all I really would like to see at this point is the courts to open up. If you're going to fill out a hardship declaration, then show up with the proof that shows that you've been impacted. If you have, let's utilize that court system to connect those people with the relief that they should then be eligible for if they have in fact experienced a hardship. But that circle has not been closed. All of the relief that has been proposed and supposedly provided is contingent upon a housing provider having a tenant in place who's eligible. So that's, again, still living in the unit and actually experienced the hardship. Or the other thing that we have that I've experienced too is where the tenant was there for a number of months for free and now they're gone. So that person's not left in the equation to help connect that aid from the originating source and back to me as that housing provider that experienced that loss. So, I guess if there's anything you guys can do today about this, if they are going to extend this moratorium, then let's double down on the due diligence to make sure that the people that have experienced this hardship are connected with the aid. And if they're not experiencing the hardship, then we need to make an example and get these folks out so that these housing providers like myself can get good paying tenants back in. And I'll leave you with this. When we lose revenues, it doesn't just hurt the person who's not paying us. It hurts everybody else around. So if I'm losing all of my rent on a few units, that's money that's not paying for that unit. And then that overflow can't get put into proactive repairs and maintenance for my good tenants that are paying. So I've got good tenants that are frustrated saying, how come we can't get X, Y, or Z done? And it's because the revenue simply isn't there. So if we're going to extend this moratorium, for the love of God, please put some sort of due diligence portion into that can really start to vet out who's truly in need and who's not. And I appreciate your time immensely this morning.
Well, thank you, Rich. And in your comments, you did something that is missing very much in Albany, is you provided some logic and reason on some of the things, and unfortunately, we don't see that enough here in Albany. Next,
could I leave you off with one thing? I'm so sorry. I just thought of it.
Please do.
Yeah. And if any of you would like this report, the city of Rochester conducted a study last summer where they looked at evictions, and they wanted to take a look at both who were the frequent filers of evictions and the types of properties that experienced the most evictions. And what was not so surprising to me, but maybe to some, the folks that own the least number of properties are often the people that file the most evictions. The types of properties that experience the highest rate of evictions are singles and doubles, which in essence are the most affordable rental properties. So for all the talk about how the landlords are the big wealthy guys, the people that are getting hurt the most right now are oftentimes people within the concentrations of poverty that are starting to try to build wealth for themselves and their family via the most affordable rental properties. And they're the people that are getting decimated. So where they finally start to get on that ladder of wealth creation for themselves and their families, they're getting pushed right back off. And the people that are benefiting are the big guys that can absorb the losses. So, if anybody downstate needs some ammunition to fight this fight, understand that this is, it's not a black and white issue. It's an issue where oftentimes the minorities, the first generation immigrants, the people that are trying to rise up out of poverty are the people that are being punished the most in all of it.
And may I make a quick comment? I apologize. The PPE loans are totally useless. They do not help people that are in storage units or landlords. So you can't get the PPE loan. And I'm not sure the name. Jamie, if you could tell me the name of the supposed rent relief thing from whatever, I forgot the name of it, but it's been defunct since February. It's now almost May. And it's supposed to be coming online for 2 weeks. And it's been 5 months. So please get that online, please.
Right. That's the very least we could do is get that. It's $2.3 billion. But thank you. Thank you very much, Rich.
Thank you.
For those words. Next, I want to introduce Elise Zaccaro, who's from West Hampton, and she's a property owner too. Elise, would you share your story with us?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. I really appreciate everybody taking the time and having this conversation. I feel like small landlords have been screaming into the wind for the past 14 months. And hearing these stories today is heartbreaking. Landlord is a bad word in New York. It just is. It connotes either these giant buildings with a ton of units or the slumlord. But it's simply not true. There are bad landlords, but there are bad tenants. And this moratorium has created a group of bad actors. It's tenants who are taking advantage of the moratorium because they can. There is no recourse. Housing courts have been closed for 14 months. That's unconstitutional. That's denying me the right to due process. And I've done a lot of research and I've done a lot of reading. I'm not in the law, but I don't think the Constitution stops or pauses because of a pandemic. I haven't read that anywhere, that's for sure. My husband and I rented our family home that we had for 15 years, that we saved for and bought because I moved for a job. I didn't want to sell the house and I didn't want it sitting empty. I thought somebody else might enjoy it and take good care of it. That was the agreement. That was the trust. The plan was to move back in May 2020 when the tenant's lease was up. And then the moratorium hit in March. And it took me nearly a year to get my home back. And the fear of losing that property and the stress and the anxiety and the toll on our family, I never made it to court. Not going into the details of the case, but I feel fortunate, but I had to settle. I had to have a settlement to get my home back from someone. And it's been devastating. And it's been devastating hearing all these stories. Maybe the moratorium made sense early on, no doubt. Tenants in need needed some protection. Look, it was panic. It was a pandemic. It was something unprecedented, But now it's critical that both tenants and landlords are protected, and a blanket moratorium isn't the answer. Essentially, the moratorium confiscates property in order to house people whom the state should be helping, while denying tax-paying property owners the right to due process. Is it reasonable to force landlords to bear the burden of housing tenants for free during a crisis? That is, to me, a very scary precedent and completely unsustainable. It puts landlords in an impossible situation. So throughout this process, I've met a lot of people. I joined Twitter to keep the conversation going. But I met a lovely man on Long Island, my neighbor. He helped his son buy his first home. He took a home equity loan against the family home to help the son buy the home. The son was in the Army. He was about to move into his home when he got deployed, went to serve. They decided to rent the home to what seemed like a lovely woman, a daughter, a bunny rabbit, show up, rent the house. She was there a few months, stopped paying rent. Moratorium kicks in, still not paying rent, collecting unemployment, running an illegal business out of the home, eviscerates the man on Facebook, posts her vacation videos on Facebook, her elaborate meals that she cooks on the weekends. He has no access to this house. He's tens of thousands of dollars in debt. He pays his property taxes. He pays the mortgage. He can't get into court. He's had his case adjourned 3 times. The next court date is May 12th. If this gets extended, that gets extended. To me, that is unfair. This is a 2-year process of trying to keep your head above water with a property that somebody's stealing your sweat, for lack of a better, to be blunt, which I am. Look, a blanket extension to me is not the solve. For me, it's open the housing courts. Every other court in New York State is operational. If you listen to Judge DeFiore's weekly video updates, criminal courts going, civil courts going, small claims going, she touts hundreds, if not thousands, of virtual hearings. They've resumed. Senator Kavanaugh said, because COVID numbers are going up, it's not safe to be in the courts. Whereas Governor Cuomo this week touted positivity rate is about 2%, lowest since November. So why can't the housing courts function? I don't understand. Virtual hearings. At least in January, CBS News asked Governor Cuomo about pre-existing cases in housing court. He said if it was pre-COVID or not COVID impacted, those cases should proceed. At least open the courts and let the pre-COVID cases already in process continue. Clear off that docket so we can play a little catch up, because we're just kicking the can down the road here. I mean, it's inevitable the courts are going to open up, and then what? So start the phased process at least. Be smart about it. And yes, strengthen the COVID relief form. You fill out a form. There needs to be greater accountability. You fill out a form that says you have hardship. You don't have to prove that hardship. You just mail it in. So instead of mass mailing, some representatives did, mass mailing court forms to tenants, why don't they try to pair those tenants up with the relief and the need and the help that they need versus mailing out these forms that seem to go into the ether anyway? Yes, it's you could perjury. And who's enforcing that? There's nobody enforcing that. But it's like a get out of jail free card or a get out of rent free card at this point. The CDC moratorium, which somebody referred to earlier, lays out specific guidelines for who is eligible for hardship. Why doesn't New York State follow those guidelines? Massachusetts announced yesterday it's following the guidelines. Connecticut eased restrictions yesterday. There are neighbors. And relief, again, touched on earlier. There's been a lot of talk about relief for landlords in this bill. Mortgage lenders are not excusing mortgages or payments. Yeah, maybe they're delaying it, but you still have to. You're going to have to pay those payments down the road. That's the operative word here. The debt still needs to be paid. With many landlords struggling to figure out how to do it when tenants have stopped paying rent because they can. And there's certainly been no freeze on property taxes. I was happy to write my several checks a couple of weeks ago. And I think Rich said it, for a landlord to receive relief in this bill, it's contingent upon the tenant filling out the paperwork. So if you have a tenant that stopped paying rent, that plans to leave, skip out in the middle of the night, which I've had stories about that, or, simply demand, and also is demanding money to leave the property, are they going to fill out this form for a landlord? Why can't a landlord apply for relief on their own? And then the contingency we talked about, if a landlord does accept relief, there's a catch. You take the money, but you're prevented from evicting the tenant for another year. I've heard from landlords that say, I don't even want the relief because I don't want to be victimized by this tenant for another year. So they're walking away. I have a friend in Queens who's selling her parents' two-family house. The tenant has made it untenable. This is a woman who's been there 25 years. They treated her like their grandmother. She's selling it below market value just to get out of the house and let the next person who's buying it with the tenant in there deal with the problem. I mean, it's an unbelievable situation. There needs to be balance and equity for both tenants and landlords. Open the courts, let the pre-COVID cases proceed, get greater accountability for this hardship form, and allow landlords to apply for relief with no strings attached. And I leave you with this story. If you guys have time, Google the story, a New York Magazine story about Heidi Russell, who's a lovely woman. We've become friends. She owns a co-op in Manhattan. She rented out a room to make ends meet. She did it in the past. She was an Airbnb tenant that she knew, a woman with a child. She turned out to be a serial grifter. who spent the last decade going from place to place to place, living in someone's home, not paying rent, and eventually driving people out of their homes, which is what's happened to Heidi. She's over $100,000 in debt. 3 is going through the courts. Had an eviction warrant issued pre-COVID, can't be executed because she can't get back into the court. Like, would any of us want to house these type of people? It makes no sense. So the extending the moratorium is just really kicking the can down the road. Let's just make a solve for everybody, but it has to be fair and balanced. I'm done.
Thank you. No, thank you. And I think your words help.
I'm passionate. I'm sorry. It's just.
It's good. I'm glad you are. And it's important. And thank you for sharing those words and stories with us. Next, I want to introduce Deb Hall, who is with the Finger Lakes Landlord Association. Deb, the floor is yours.
Hi. It's hard to follow up on all the heartbreak, but I would say collectively our association represents about 150 members. We have over 3,000 units among those members, and we're hearing and seeing the same stories. I thank you all for dealing with this issue, which we are, labeling an unnecessary eviction moratorium. It isn't necessary because of all of the laws that are already in place. Jamie mentioned them, Elise mentioned them. There is a timeline built into all these laws that protect tenants and have protected them since now 2019. And the judges can have discretion on staying orders of eviction. And again, based on hardship declarations, I think there's plenty of space for the courts to start using and exercising that discretion in cases that make sense. But you can't even get in, as has been said here, if there's an eviction moratorium in place, because the courts won't even touch it. They won't schedule it. They're going to wait it out. And the opportunity for bad actors to continue. And even what we've seen is marginal tenants who may have had, maybe struggled with their rent have now just turned into bad tenants because they know they can't be taken to court. And once that news spreads like a wildfire throughout the rental unit or even among friends, they just keep pushing the envelope. We've had stories in our region about, the boldness of tenants going right to the landlord's face and saying, there's nothing you can do about it. And landlords standing back and saying, they're right. There is no longer anything we can do about it. And that is just, again, it's unsustainable, it's untenable. We've mentioned here too about the billions of dollars in federal rent relief money that's available. It is heartbreaking, literally heartbreaking. I want to cry thinking that the state knew this money was available in January. They did not put a process in place to have an application ready. They pushed it into the budget. They knew it was going to pass. They knew that money was available, and the application is still not available. And if it isn't available and the Democrat majority knows it's not going to be available, this application for months, is that the premise for extending an eviction moratorium? Because they know that the application process that they fought for in the budget is now not going to be available for tenants for another 3 months. That I would fire everyone at OTDOT and say, what is going on here? The private sector could have an application process up and running in a month or less. And the state has just unimaginable resources and can't have an application within 5 months. It's embarrassing to be from New York. It's embarrassing in that regard. I also participate on a housing consortium in the Finger Lakes region. It's a 4-county consortium. And these are the housing providers that I think Rich mentioned as well, the Section 8 providers and those folks. They want to help tenants. They're waiting for tenants to call them. But again, they have to be able to connect with the tenants who are most in need. That has been done when skip courts, which is the special COVID intervention part that was created for some of the counties and some of the judicial districts, they were present at court. They had representatives who could identify a need and align a tenant with funding, and they could start working on a settlement and not have to go through the eviction process. These tenants also, a lot of them had never been in need of financial assistance. So they didn't know where to go or how to do this process. So having them in court and getting them access to these providers was beneficial to them. They also had access to legal representation. They could apply for it, or they had somebody there from the legal assistance societies that were agencies that could give them some guidance right there on the spot. So stopping court processes doesn't help the tenant. It doesn't help them. I understand that it's stressful to go to court. Just as Rich said, it's stressful for tenants or for landlords to go to court as well. Nobody wants to go to court, but they are a third party, what am I trying to say? The
arbitrator.
Arbitrator. Thank you. A mediator. They have to be able to hear the case and make a decision so that both sides can air their disputes and settle the dispute and move on. But just, as everyone said, kicking the can down the road. Bringing tenants to courts will give them access. I think that the eviction moratorium will change the market dynamics in the long term. We've all talked about the short-term issue, but long-term, you're talking 5-10 years is going to change the makeup. Affordable units, as Rich mentioned, the local housing provider will fix up distressed units and will make them available and will be an on-site manager. But out-of-town owners will not necessarily do that. They're looking for the highest return. The other part of it is that this region already, especially in my region in the Finger Lakes, which is basically rural, we already have fairly low market rents. We're at between $700 and $900 for a 2-bedroom. That is way below the market rate rent for that HUD identifies. And so we've got room, but tenants aren't going to have room because the income doesn't match. So affordability is based on income. And again, the economy has a two-way street, being able to go out and get a job, being able to use that money to provide yourself some housing, and then all the other program providers can fill in the gap, if you will. But if we don't have a fluid housing market, which is preempted by the ability to take tenants in and out of apartments where they're not paying and to be able to make a landlord whole, it just isn't going to work. I too have stories of immigrant family who owns a 24-unit building here in Wayne County that is currently 50% in non-payment for over 8 months, which equals about $20,000 in arrears. This was their retirement money. They worked all their life. This was a little bit of extra cash for them. And cash flow has completely stopped. They're just barely paying the bills. So again, we don't see where an eviction moratorium is going to help anybody. It causes more confusion for the courts. We've already mentioned HSTPA has laws in effect. COVID-related laws put strict guidelines on even starting evictions, but the eviction process takes 6 to 8 weeks anyways. There's your eviction moratorium. You don't need to add another law to add more congestion to the courts. So I say let the process begin so the state can actually, and I think this is the most important thing, that the state can actually get a good count on real evictions and real reasons for evictions, both pre-COVID and COVID related, whether they're non-payment, holdover, nuisance, illegal occupancy, all that kind of stuff. I've watched some of the joint budget hearings when they were discussing these issues, and nobody has real data. The courts is the best place to collect this kind of data because anybody in their right mind can conjecture, I guess they can make speculation about what that number is. But if you have the data on paper, you're actually going to be able to make some good decisions. And the majority should want to know what that real number is. They should want to know because they're directing the funding. And they should be pushing OTDOT to push that funding out the door because it's on a 150-day use it or lose it timeline. And once we get to September and that money hasn't been put out the door because we don't have any real data and we don't have any movement in the courts, we're going to be sitting on this issue and facing distressed properties and a lot of homelessness, or at least hard to house in the long-term future. So I just beg the majority, please do not pass this legislation. It does nobody any good. There's already laws in place, and we just need to move forward together, shoulder to shoulder, tenants and landlords together, and start putting this behind us. So I thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Deb, and thanks for pointing out those specifics on some of the programs that are desperately needed. Before we go to questions, I want to just toss it very quickly to John Lamondes, who represents Central New York, and he had a quick story he wanted to share with this group. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Leader. And thank you to all of you who have come to share your stories with us. I just want to let you know that I am one of you as a property owner. And as a second-generation American, Deb, to your comments that you just made, the punishment of success is something we ought to get out of the business of. And I don't understand why this dynamic is going. Our families all came here for a reason. And to see these things systematically being placed to hurt several different levels across the economy is really troubling. And I just want you to know that as a legislator, I share your story. I share the pain and the hurt that this causes you. I have rental experience in 5 states and have gone through the eviction process in 2. New York is the worst of the 5 that I personally have professional experience in. And this hurts everybody from late bills and late payments. And one of you made the comment of landlords. You know, the story that never gets out is landlords working with tenants and letting late fees go and doing everything possible to keep a good tenant in a property. And I as well have done that. And that benevolence is never reflected in this argument at all. It's never brought forward. It's all which I can't remember which one of you said the punishment. That whole aspect is left out of this, and that's a terrible thing to see. I just wanted you to know that I share this with you. In my county alone, going through the eviction process was a terrible thing. The waste of manpower involved with the number of police officers that had to be there, the coordination that had to take place, the cost and expense that the property owner bears in doing this. All for somebody that, in my case and in many, is just simply taking advantage of the system. And we call them professional tenants, and they know very well. To the one of you that made the statement, they know exactly to the day how long they can stay in a apartment or a home or a unit, and this is very troubling. And so, if I can help any of you in any way, please feel free to reach out. And I'll leave it there. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, John. So we're going to move to some questions. You know, what I've heard from everybody, it sounds like similar. Lack of accountability, unsustainable, one-sided, and unintended consequences. And I think that sort of sums up the situation we're in. I would mention that we have some good news, I think. This moratorium was supposed to be taken up by the legislature today, but it looks like it's being pushed off to Monday. So that'll give us more time to share your stories with our colleagues across the aisle. And hopefully, we can push back, and it'd be great to stop this if all possible. So with that, if people are interested in asking questions, please raise your hand and Mike Frazier will call on you.
Okay, the first question is from CNY Central. You are unmuted. Go right ahead.
I think I muted myself when you did it. Yeah. Good morning. My name's Connor. I'm a reporter with WSTM WTVH out of Syracuse. This is definitely a Syracuse centralized story, but it may have been something that many of you have heard. We've had an issue with the Greenland property owners here, particularly at the Skyline apartment. And something that we've heard, at least from their perspective, is that they've had a lot of trouble in terms of evicting some of the more problematic tenants within the building that is causing trouble for other tenants. We heard it from a few of the landlords that have given some testimony here. So this is sort of a catch-all question for some of the landlords that have already spoken. If you'd like to chime back in, is this something that you're seeing as a widespread issue, that you don't have tools to evict tenants that are causing problems at the moment?
Jamie, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, I can field this one. As a practitioner, I'm primarily in the Rochester area, but I cover the entire state. I had an attempted murder. A gun was actually shot and was, but for the fact that it jammed, somebody would have been gravely injured, if not killed. And that tenant and the process, we went to court. We were able to prove that it was obviously not only a lease violation, but a grave endangerment to every other tenant, because the gun was never recovered and this person was violent multiple times after that event on the property. I had a warrant that was supposed to issue 12/31, 12/28, we get this new law, and I am not able to remove that tenant still. So yes, the problem is existing, even with the nuisance exceptions. because of the paperwork required, you actually have to continuously refile a bunch of new forms every single time the courts stop and start and reopen, because they now want you to prove that the nuisance that occurred before the law change is still currently existing. Well, sometimes that's just not possible because one single event was so egregious, you need to remove that tenant because maybe they behave for 3 months, but there's a risk 6 months down the line. The problem is that the court system has too much discretion over nuisance and over things that are exasperating the use and occupancy of other tenants at the property. So it's an absolute problem. And, I'm giving you a very severe issue. So you can imagine just, generalized issues that are happening daily, which prohibit tenants from fully enjoying their property. They look to the landlord to fix it. The landlord has no recourse at the moment.
So just as a quick follow up here for people who may be unfamiliar with the actual letter of the law here, why is it an issue that the eviction moratorium seem to have been primarily focused on the impacts of the pandemic having an issue when it comes to rental payments? What is the roadblock here if a tenant has done something clearly flagrantly illegal and has been arrested? Why is that still an issue here?
Because the courts aren't open. There's simply no ability to get into court. And there have been orders to show cause that have been filed to ask the court system to open on severe situations. And they have said that without guidance from the state and from OCA, they will not hear those cases. And so again, it's just a patchwork, depending on what court you're in the state, to whether you have access. Some courts have not opened since the pandemic started. Some courts have been continuously opening. Some can go virtual, some can't. It is not consistent across the state. And it's a dire need to get all of it to be on track, handled the same way. Nobody in Long Island should be treated differently than someone in Buffalo. It's just unfair at this point. And again, it raises the constitutional issue of landlords have no access to due process.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from Nick Reisman. Nick, go ahead.
Hey there. I was just curious. I know some of the landlords may have touched on this, but has there been any sort of impact on your business from some of the benefits from the federal stimulus package, from efforts by the state to help landlords, as they say? Has that had any positive effect on your ability to remain somewhat whole during all of this?
Why don't we have, I think we'll know what the answer is, and just let you know that money hasn't started to flow yet, Nick, that we passed in the budget for landlords. That's one of the frustrations, is why other states have been able to implement a program. Why hasn't New York? And what's the delay? But Deb, do you want to, I saw your head shaking. Do you want to address Nick's question?
Yeah, I mean, I can briefly, just saying that once the CARES Act and, Recovery Acts had been in place, early COVID, there was some hope that small landlords being treated as small businesses would be able to apply for loans or small business relief or PPP, which was the pay check protection, those types of fundings. And landlords did not qualify for a variety of reasons, which, I'm not an accountant or a banker. So, but the main reason is that they didn't qualify because they either didn't have an employee, they were self-employed, maybe the nature of their LLC or the number of properties they had or their overall net worth. But I've had one landlord who applied for a small business loan and she applied for much more, but was given $1,000. And that was maybe back in September. And that's it. That's all that I've heard. So, and again, as Mr. Barclay alluded to, the rent relief money is really the money that is the most reasonable fund, because it requires a tenant in need and a landlord who's owed arrears. And for that money to languish in the state coffers for 5 months is absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the $100 million that was available last summer, I think only 40% of that was put out. And again, just ridiculous for a majority who is crying that there are millions of renters in possible eviction, and to not have the money out the door it's just a theft. I think it's a theft on our ability to provide housing. So no other monies have been available to landlords. Just didn't qualify, and for the most part, especially our small landlords who are non-corporate without employees.
Thanks, Deb.
Thank you.
Nick, hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Seth Wallace. Seth, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My question was going to be for the legislators. What response are you getting from the majority when you raise the concerns that you have about this bill? But I can still ask that, I guess. But with the recent development announced by Assemblyman Barclay, anything, I know it was very recent, but anything you can tell us about why it was moved or how you plan to use this extra time?
So my understanding, they changed it because they're concerned about some drafting problems in the bill, but we're not clear exactly what those are. But anytime we can move a bill off the agenda and push it farther back, that gives us more time to relay these stories to the majority and how much these types of pieces of legislation are really hurting New York. And I think it's important to emphasize the unintended consequences. Of course, as legislators, we want to help tenants that are in need. I think these landlords would like to help tenants in need, but there needs to be balance. And ultimately, we think this moratorium probably will end up hurting tenants more than it's going to help tenants. So those are the messages I know I'm sure this conference is going to try to raise on the floor if this bill does come up next week when we debate it, but we'll do it privately too. And again, the more time we have to stall it, the more time we have to let our story, these people's story, be known.
You know, Seth, if I could jump into this, it's just another example of the absolute indifference that the Assembly majority has toward the problems that property owners and landlords are facing. They view all landlords as if they were the major, the big players. And it's just not true. The majority of them are small people like the people you've met today who are trying to provide a service, a safe, affordable place to live, and they treat their tenants as the customers that they are. And when you have, you make your business grow and thrive by treating your customers well. And this is what these people do. And when you create the incentive to game the system, which I'm sorry to say this, but the Democratic majority is okay with. They see that, whether it's sticking it to the man, which many of them believe, are in agreement with, but it's not fair. Especially when you get into New York City, where much of the housing stock is very old and in need of great repair. It's just not fair all the way around. But fairness is not the issue to them. It's, the politics is very simple to figure out. There are many more tenants than there are landlords. And it's just absolute indifference, that they show toward landlords. And it's very sad. I'm reminded of a quote by Elie Wiesel. He said, the opposite of hate, of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And, the Assembly majority doesn't just hate landlords, they're indifferent to them. They don't care about the problems they have. And, it's foolish thinking, because the housing stock is suffering as a result. And the ability to provide safe, affordable housing suffers as a result of this indifference.
Thanks, Mike. Seth, does that answer your question?
Yes, I'm all set. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Mike, it looks like we're done, right, as far as questions?
Yep, that's it.
Okay, I'd like just to close again, thank all of our speakers. It is incredibly important that you participate in this and shared your stories because they give us the stories that we can relay to the majority and try to push back on some of this ill thought out process and legislation. So thank you very much for doing it. I want to thank the members of our conference for being on. And please realize you do have friends in Albany. We do understand your issues, and we will do everything we can to try to assist you. So thank you, everybody, for participating.